Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those that are joining us from the East Coast. My name is Ryan Langcloss with the Esri Public Safety team here today. Thanks for joining us on this installment of the Esri Emergency Management webinar series. We're going to be talking about 3 keys to disaster readiness. We're talking about scalability, availability, and capabilities today. I've got a great group of presenters today. I'm excited about the team that's joined us to talk about these subjects. I think you're going to learn quite a bit from them. We've got Ray and Sarah, who are on our solutions team, and both architects and engineers of how we should be thinking about making sure that our enterprise, our on-premise servers scale to handle the load and really can stand up in mission-critical environments. And then we've got Paul and Kelly with us today on our product side with the online team, 2 of my personal in-house heroes here who are working behind the scenes with ArcGIS Online and really active in disaster response. For those of you who may have seen their names in multiple blogs, but also interacted with them on disaster response for availability of online applications, have some great tips as well. So these collection of folks here are experts in their disciplines, and we're going to have a great time today. So we're going to talk in specific order today of a couple of things. One is about capabilities. What should you have in place before the next event to make sure that you have the capabilities at hand to respond to disasters effectively? And then we're going to transition about how do we make sure that those things are available on premise and talk about really high availability to make sure that those things, again, can stand up on premise when needed most. And then we'll transition finally to scalability, and we'll look at ArcGIS Online and how do we get viral apps to stand up to the massive load as public information and the demand that comes out from media and from the public when they need it as well. And so we'll give you a lot of tips and examples of how to be thinking about this, and then some resources at the end of today to follow up and really dig into these 3 specific areas that we truly believe will help you be more prepared for the next disaster when it does occur. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started this morning. Everybody has been muted as attendees, so if you do have a question, we would encourage you just to chat with us. So use the chat window that you see in the GoToWebinar. You can ask questions of us at any time throughout the morning. We'll try to answer as many as we can using the text option here, and we'll reply to you. And if it is kind of a broad question, we'll certainly share that question and answer broadly through the chat window with everybody else that's attending, just so you can kind of see what others are asking as well. Now, if we don't get to your question today, know that we will certainly follow up directly with you on that question and get you the support or answer that you might need. If it's a specific instance or a question you've got about your environment, we'll certainly do a follow-up with you for that. We are going to record this morning, so a lot of resources we're going to talk through from the teams here will be captured on this recording. So I would certainly encourage you after this event to bookmark this recording when it comes out. You will get an email from us with links to follow to certain pages that we're going to reference today, and blog posts and things that you can reference back and use as kind of guides to get your environment ready for the next disaster. But certainly bookmark this recording, reference back to it, share it with others that you know in your community, and really start to build this preparedness level up as we kind of look towards the end of the calendar year 2018 and into 2019 for us here at Esri. So I want to start and really just kind of level set about capabilities. We mentioned that the first thing that we wanted to kind of level set on is, what capabilities do you need to be prepared for the next disaster? And here at Esri, the reason I'm here, right, personally here being at Esri, is because we truly have the ability as a team, right, as a company with the backing of Jack, and the reason that we were founded is really to help solve the world's most difficult problems. And for me in public safety, that is, personally and passionately about responding to disasters of all types, all sizes around the world. And as a team here at Esri, the folks that you're going to hear from today play a part in this as well. They are part of this disaster response team that we talk about a lot on webinars. We're going to introduce that team in just a minute. But ultimately, we want you to know that when disaster strikes, that Esri is here to support you in any way possible. And as a team and as a company, we have been doing this disaster response operation for about 20 years. We've supported, again, all types, all sizes of events. This year right now has been extremely active for us in 2018. As you can imagine right now, the wildfires in California are certainly front of mind. So we're, thoughts out to those individuals there on the West Coast that we're supporting. And, for those of you that live in the Southeast, you had, devastating impacts of Florence and Michael this year as well, and flooding. And those events are going to continue, right? And so we want you to know that what we do when we respond, not only just to help you, is just to learn. And those lessons that we take away from all those incidents are what we're going to talk about here as capabilities. But before I even get to that, I want you to know how to find us. So if you leave today and you know that you need support during a disaster, I want you to know what we can help provide for you. And that is, when you find that your capacity is exceeded in any number of ways that we'll talk about, you can reach out to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we're there to kind of stand with you through that event. And so how do we help? There are 4 specific ways that we typically help. One is just making sure you have the right mix of ArcGIS software, our technology, making sure that, if you need to scale up for volunteers that are on site, or, if you completely lose an infrastructure due to some disaster from a flood, for example, which has happened before, then we can certainly help you get that back in place and up and running as quickly as possible. We also help with workflow implementation. So that's really where we're going to talk a bulk about our capabilities today that we want you to be thinking about, which is, how do we do things like damage assessment after an event so that we can capture that record, move that money into the community as quickly as possible. We do a lot with geospatial data. So a lot of people ask, I've got raw imagery, I've got drone imagery coming in now, and it's continuing to trend upward. How do we process that? How do we get it from a raw format into usable applications for decision makers? And we certainly help with that quite a bit. So you can reach out, and a lot of times it's just, I have data I want to share, or I'm looking for data, and we kind of play a switchboard, so to speak, to connect you both to individuals and organizations that have data and then make sure that data is usable. And then, of course, tech support. So should something happen to any one of your applications that are running today on Esri technology, we want you to know that we see those as mission critical, right? We understand how important it is to make sure that those applications support you and stand up when they need to be. So we can certainly help you escalate things through premium tech support, get folks on the phone to really sit with you and figure that out in an expeditious way, not just kind of through the normal technical support channel. So we certainly can help there. And whenever you need to find us, there are 2 ways you can do that. You can go to our website at esri.com/disaster, and you can fill out a request for assistance directly at the top of the page. Just tell us what you're looking for, what you need from us. And even if you don't know 100% what you need at this point, we can certainly help triage that and help get the right mix of things together for you. And if you can't remember the website, you want to take a note down in your phone, send us an email. You can always email us at disaster_help@esri.com. Now that email goes into our team here at the core. It will set off all sorts of good bells and whistles, and we do pay attention when those requests come in through either channel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So know that we're here to stand with you. So let's transition a bit to the capability side of that. So a lot of the questions we get are beyond just, what can Esri provide is, what are the typical things that people ask for around workflows? What are the challenges that organizations have? Now, this next section I'm going to talk about, we have done a kind of a deeper webinar. I'm going to kind of pass through it pretty quickly today, and we're going to get to more how you make sure these things stand up. But we have done a deeper webinar on this already through the webinar series. So if you would go back to the website where you register for this event, you'll find the recording of that from back earlier this year. And we'll make sure that we get you a link to that as well, the email that goes out at the end of the day. And you'll also see that referenced on the last slide. But in advance, there are typically these 6 challenges that we find are very common for organizations. People are trying to quickly understand what the potential impact could be before, a hurricane makes landfall, for the flood forecast that's coming in. And ultimately, how do we determine when and where to deploy our limited resources to have the most effect to save lives and protect property? And then the third part is really how do we monitor once the event starts to unfold around us, those rapidly changing conditions, right? The world of real time, the Internet of Things that's around us is providing us with tons of sensors that are wired up to measure everything from air quality to land movement. And so how do we harness that together? How do we filter the noise away and really help understand where we need to be modifying our plans of action based on what those changing conditions are telling us? So that's kind of the third big area that we see a lot of requests. And then ultimately, it's, the event has occurred. How do we assess and report the damage? So how do we create that record of what the event actually did to our communities, to our infrastructure, to document that monetarily as well as just physically so that we can start the rebuilding process and recovery efforts to some new state of normal for an organization or to an agency or in your communities. And then the last 2 are really about information movement in real time, and that is, how do we help people make sure that what they are planning and what they are putting into practice for a response is really being shared in real time across organizations, partner agencies, as well as just inside the agency, right? The events are hectic. These operational periods, they get established, every 12 hours or 6 hours or whatever that time frame is that is set for the operational period, has a set plan. And so how do we make sure that everything that's being conducted in real time around that incident for that period is truly up to date and briefed against the next operational period so that our plans are more responsive and not reactive. And then the last part is how we communicate effectively with the public, and this is where we're going to talk a lot about today in terms of the viral nature of applications as well, but to make sure that we are communicating with the public, when and where to take action and what to do when that action is needed. And so we'll talk a bit about that. So those 6 things really boil down into what we consider 3 main areas that I really want you to focus on from a capability side. And then this will be where I'd like for you to kind of think about some of the information products, right? The applications that you need to have up and running to do these three main things. And the first main thing that boils up from those elements I just mentioned, those challenges that we typically find, is about maintaining situational awareness. And this is, how do we monitor the changing conditions in real time? And we have applications like operations dashboard for ArcGIS that can be configured with feeds from our Living Atlas and other content to really provide you a real-time look at what's going on around an incident to help understand when and where to take action and what that might mean for us. And then operations management. So how do we put our plan into action? And the one just to the bottom of the operations dashboard on the screen, is Web App Builder, and it has a standard data model with symbology that's common for incident command. And so how do we move those chess pieces, so to speak, around the board and put our plan that lives in a binder into action digitally in response to what we're seeing in real time, and keep that current, right, as we start to get inputs from that real-time data. And then on the right-hand side, it's like, how do we brief things? We want to be able to maintain situational awareness means not just hitting pause in our cadence of an operation and compiling a static PowerPoint, but it's truly getting into the idea of using story maps in our parlance here at Esri to conduct operational briefings that consume those real-time information elements from the dashboard, that take the plan that you've kind of put into a digital format in the bottom, and then wrap that into a narrative that you can tell, this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, and this is where we're headed in the next operational period. And that that whenever you make one of those chess pieces move on the board, that map and that briefing is up to date for everybody to see. So this is all about helping you anticipate your next move, to make sure you have information at your fingertips to take better decisions at time that's needed. So that's the first one. The second area that we really want to focus on is around kind of assessing damage, and really, how do we, number one, before that, understand potential impact? And so the app you see on the left is a situation awareness viewer. This is Web App Builder, has a situation awareness widget. And this is, I can take a feature of any type, whether that's a flood forecast, a storm warning polygon coming in, or you manually draw a point or line or polygon on the map and tell you who and what might be impacted under that zone. And so this ability to quickly do that and then to generate a report out that can help on, in the resource estimation, understanding what we might need to be calling in, when our resources might be exceeded locally and we need to talk, to mutual aid level type resourcing. And then on the right side, it's like the event has happened. How do we start to catalog and do that? So we have two applications that work in tandem here to support this assessment, and that is the operations dashboard for ArcGIS, as you see in the bottom right, that is connected through a feature service to Survey123, the application you see on the right, for mobile devices to work in both connected and disconnected environments to really collect the damage assessment, right? What's happened to the physical infrastructure in our communities, and to be able to report that back in and monitor the thresholds for reporting so that ultimately those funds can be reached and accessed, and then that money starts to move back into the community. And so this is all about movement of information in a timely manner, having information at our fingertips, again, to understand the impact and the level of resourcing we need to report those things back out, both internally and externally. So that's the second big capability that we'll leave you with. And then the final capability that I really want you to be focused on is this idea of managing the flow of public information. Your voice as an agency is the authoritative voice that we need people to be listening for, and we need to be taking action upon. And so how do we make sure that you can disseminate critical information that raises awareness of when and where to take action, what you want people to do when it's time to take action, and ultimately gets them to take action, which is the most difficult part sometimes. And so this application here, this is Web Application Builder in a skinned down version with a bit of a narrative in the top right. This is the soundbite media chunk that says, this is what the problem is, take action when you see this, as well as then the map itself, which is responsive in nature so that it does work well on mobile devices, on tablets, so that, no matter where a citizen or a person touches this application from, whether they're sitting at home on a laptop or they're actually in the car on a mobile device, this application will work in a responsive way and reformat itself to that device screen so that it's a nice user experience. And that's one of the keys to this. And we'll talk a lot about how we make sure that these apps then stand up and can scale to handle the load of people hitting on them at high velocity. So that's our capabilities. So we're going to, again, I would encourage you to go back and get a much deeper look at those capabilities and demonstrations of each of those information products in our previous webinar. Again, we will leave you with a link today at the end. But if you really think about how you can maintain situational awareness, you assess the damage and conduct damage assessment, how you manage your flow of public information together, I think you will be much better suited for the next disaster. Now, the key behind this too for us here at Esri is that we don't want any one of these information products to be standalone, right? We definitely don't want to build silos. And so we are working behind the scenes to make sure that the information model, right, the data that feeds these applications truly flows between them all in an integrated way. So when you move the chess piece on the board for the plan, that it actually rolls back out when it's appropriate to the public on the public information map. So we are truly connecting all of these together through ArcGIS to enable better decisions at the right time that we hopefully help you, again, respond as effectively as possible to any incident at any time. So with that, now I would like to kind of transition. So we're thinking about capabilities. So when you leave today, you're going to kind of study up, you're going to find out those capabilities. We know that those capabilities are important, again, off that history. So how do we make sure now that those applications run inside of your architecture? So for those of you that work on premise and have your environment set up today, we want to talk a lot about how do you scale that appropriately? How do you make sure that it is highly available, meaning that you have redundancy and you've got your processes thought through? And so I'd like to introduce Ray and Sarah. Ray is going to kind of take the lead on this as we start off with Sarah, and just take notes on this section here. There's a lot of detail behind this, and I think, again, you will find some resources at the end of today that will certainly help you start to think about architecting your infrastructure to make sure that it's available when you need it most. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ray, and the screen is all yours, Ray. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everybody. My name is Ray Bunn. I am a solution architect with Esri Patterns and Practices. For those of you who may not know, solution architects within Esri, we try to develop a shared understanding of the challenges and then align technology and skills to kind of overcome those challenges. As one of our jobs, the other aspect of our job is developing these best practices that help kind of communicate these things. So today we're going to run through some of the aspects of the best practice for high availability, and then talk about some considerations that you can apply to your situation.
And hi, my name's Sarah Schur. I'm also on the solution architecture team. I work with Ray. As a solution engineer, I still help support those same activities, but with a little bit more of a technical perspective.
Okay, so the first aspect of high availability is really this gaining this understanding that high availability is a target, and it's really about balancing this business need aspect versus the technical challenge, which of course costs money. We know that emergency management systems need to be available before, during, after a crisis. You're doing things like planning and training and operations, maybe reviews afterwards. And when you talk to business people, the people in the business of emergency management, the need tends to come across as 24/7 by 365. And while that's true, the reality is we need the system to be available when we need it, but that's not necessarily all the time. It's just those times when it's needed. So there is a gap between those two things. As a technologist, that gap is important, because the difference between running a system that is essentially has to always be available versus one that may have some downtime, there's a difference there. So we'll talk through some of those. And Sarah, if you want to cover the best practice, that would be great.
Sure, yeah. So, high availability is really a goal for your system, right? To meet this prearranged level of performance during a specific period of time. So, as Ray said, we like to think of high availability as, all 24/7, 365, but that's really pretty unrealistic, especially cost prohibitive for most organizations. So the goal is to meet an agreed upon level of availability that's required for the business need. So another thing, important thing is that, high availability isn't this like universal target for any organization. So the definition of what high availability is going to mean different things depending on your organization's need, how critical your system is to the work you do. So for some organizations, that a highly available system might mean, a 95% SLA or service level agreement. But to others, that may be, not highly available at all. It depends on the needs. So, the goal is, a highly available system should be providing your users with an environment that meets or exceeds their business requirements. So that may be something like very specific, like the system should be available 99.9% of the time, or it could just be more of a general expectation of when the system will be available.
I think it's very important to kind of communicate those expectations and work closely between the business team and the technical team to agree. Sometimes those agreements are formal, other times they're just expectations. And I think that when we don't formalize them or we don't really agree, then somebody's going to be disappointed. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid.
Right. Yeah, and so, going, just kind of continuing off that, right? In order to achieve high availability, you have to consider a lot of things, hardware, software, governance, and so in this sense, kind of availability, as we have here, is one of many best practices for architecting the ArcGIS platform. So, high availability, though, isn't exactly a practice in the traditional sense of the word. It's really, like as we said earlier, a goal or a target. And you would use these other best practices, related best practices like environment isolation, automation, and load balancing to help you achieve that goal of high availability, whatever that means to your organization. So this document, Architecting the ArcGIS Platform Best Practices, is a compilation of about 15 plus or minus maybe 3 of these, one-page white papers or, considerations for how to architect the ArcGIS platform in a way that delivers high level of business value and reducing unnecessary cost and risk. So within it, of course, is a document about high availability as well as these other best practices that will help you achieve it. And you can access it from this link at the bottom, go.esri.com/BP.
And these documents are written for not necessarily technical people. These are one-page views of these different best practices, basically meant as an introduction to the concept. If you do have questions, our email address is on the document, and you can always ask us at any time. So what are some considerations with high availability? Number one, as we've been talking about, is really understanding the need and then kind of communicating those expectations. So we know that the higher the availability target is, so 99.99 is a pretty high level of availability. That's going to cost more than 95%. And so just agreeing on things like the resources that you have. Do you have the IT skills? Do you have the number of people? Do you have funding? Do you have the infrastructure? Do you have solid IT governance? Can you do automation? All those things that Sarah talked about as best practices. Those are all things to consider when you're setting that target. And then once you have set that target, you really need to start doing the system design. So let's talk about a few different types of scenarios. This first scenario really is very scalable. Very scalable is not the right word, but you can increase the amount of infrastructure to begin to raise the level of your availability. But this is a very simple place to start. So in an organization that doesn't have a large IT group, you may start with one server in a passive failover type situation where the second server is offline. If something happens to your first server, you can start up the second server and then have those capabilities again. The interesting aspect of this is that through ArcGIS, you're only paying for licensing on the first server, and then the offline server is not charged. Now, in between here, you do need to do some manual syncing or perhaps scripted syncing to make sure that all of the information products, all the data behind it, all the services are up to date. There are some technical documents on within ArcGIS Help that can tell you how to do this and then how to do other various scenarios. And we'll post that link here at the end. So that was a scenario for maintaining hardware on premises. Not every organization can do that. I work with a lot of emergency management organizations, and I know that many of them don't have their own separate IT. Starting to think about running highly available systems on premises without an IT group can get a little squirrely. You want to make sure that system is available when you actually need it. So an alternative to running things on premises would be to start to leverage other environments that have higher availability. And the two that you see here on the left, you've got ArcGIS Online. That has a service level agreement of 99.9%. In this case, you have to realize the infrastructure and the networks are managed by third parties, meaning not Esri. And Paul and Kelly can talk more about that perhaps later, but in addition to that, you've still got to worry about power on your side and network on your side. So there are other aspects. So this only makes the capabilities highly available to the specified service level agreement. On the right side, you've got ArcGIS Enterprise in a cloud environment. So you could have your own managed cloud. So you spin up something in Azure or AWS. You might use Esri Managed Cloud Services to help you with that as another alternative. And then lastly, you may have a third party manage the cloud environment. So you're sort of putting the infrastructure on somebody else's plate. But again, you've still got to worry about power and internet so that you can get to those capabilities. The third option we'll talk about is sort of a hybrid solution. This is popular. It's something that I've recommended to customers. Essentially, you're going to host certain capabilities in the cloud. So whether you're running ArcGIS Enterprise in one of those scenarios that we talked about in the previous scenario, or you could also use ArcGIS Online as your kind of primary environment, and just to try to get those higher availability with respect to the infrastructure that someone is managing. And then on the right side, you see the on-premises component. If you don't have the ability to, or the skills or the funding or the infrastructure to run highly available systems on inside your firewall, you could stand up a single ArcGIS Enterprise and keep that in sync with your primary environment. And you can do that to whatever level your organization is comfortable with. There's going to be some minimum operating capability. You need base maps, you need some level of data, and you need some information products. So maybe those dashboards that Ryan showed, and you pick that minimum level, and then you make sure those things stay in sync, so that if you were to lose connectivity to the internet, you would still have some ability to do things behind your firewall. So this is a sort of another simplified, very practical example of how to get high availability. So now I'd like to turn this over to Paul and Kelly, and they're going to talk about some viral apps for you.
All right, thanks, Ryan and Sarah. let me start just kind of introducing ourselves. My name is Paul Ross, product manager on the ArcGIS Online team, and Kelly, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, and I'm Kelly Giroux. I'm also a product manager on the ArcGIS Online team. And we work with customers and the emergency response team on lots of different issues and functionality with ArcGIS Online.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to start talking about, actually before we get started, we're going to go to a poll to kind of take the temperature a little bit on people. So if you would, on your screen, you should see a quick poll. And the question is, are you familiar with web services and responses? So if you would, all our attendees, would you select yes or no? And Kelly's going to use this a little bit later to talk about kind of a little bit more of her content. So again, are you familiar with web services and those responses associated with those? Just kind of a quick yes or no, if you would check that, and we'll give it a little bit of time here, 30, 40 seconds or so. While you're doing that, let me just point out one of the things that both Ray and Sarah were talking about, managing your own infrastructure. It's a lot different in ArcGIS Online. One of the things we do for you with Online is manage that infrastructure. So we'll be kind of changing our material up a little bit and talking more about the content. So let's take a look at the results of the poll. Yeah, so of course, 80% of people are familiar with web services and responses, 20% no. So hopefully we'll be able to shed some light and provide some information for both those sets of people. All right. So what you see on the graph, let me explain the graph here that you're seeing. This is typically, you see daily usage of services, maps, and applications. And the spike is one of the things we really want to talk about. What happens when all of this doubles for some reason? Just overnight, your applications or your maps are all of a sudden used twice as much as they were the day before. And this is actually a real graph from a recent event we had. It just happens to be for ArcGIS Online. You can see each one of the days there represented, kind of the ups and downs of when we see, and then you can see, boom, all of a sudden it's way up there. What happened? We're going to talk about really a couple of things. One is your information product itself, what you're putting out there, the message, the audience, and the experience. And then Kelly's going to pick up on that and really talk about best practices around viral applications. How you, since you're not managing the infrastructure, but you are managing those maps and apps. And there's a lot that you can do to make sure that when that spike happens, and it will, that you can be ready and that your applications will continue to perform and you continue to meet those needs that people have from getting that. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with kind of a checklist and resources. Really important stuff. Give you some real things to walk away from today to actually make sure that your information products are ready to go. So with that, let's start with your message. I know some of this is fundamental and it's really straightforward, but trust me, it will really lead toward successful communications. So before even starting with putting your information on ArcGIS Online, really think about the information product that you're putting out there. What is the key information that you want to come across? We, from time to time, will see very complex applications put up there when really the message was something like, here's shelter locations. Make sure that the information is related to what key information you want to provide. Think about it this way. You think about your audience that we'll talk about in a second, but what do you really want them to know after they use the app or after they see it embedded in a website? Overall, keep it simple. Really think about single purpose applications, especially when you're communicating to the public. So for example, if you're communicating shelter locations, don't also put in all kinds of polygons that would be confusing to them, but think about what you could put in there. So if you're putting in shelter locations, maybe you want to put traffic on top of that map. So there's some really useful things, but really focus on your message. So think about what you want to say, where you want to put that information, as a website. Is it going to be an application that runs by itself? And why you're doing it. And also, what's the, if you will, the call to action? What do you want them to do, or what do you want them to know after they've used the app? So the second consideration here is, who is your audience? Now, many of us who work on these disaster response maps and applications, there's different audiences. There's internal things like GIS analysts. There's local citizens. We might be working with our incident command center on a dashboard. They might be local citizens. It might be the entire world. The thing to consider here too is that, especially when things are shared publicly on the internet, they get picked up all over the place. And who might reference these or link to the map, just like the media? The media can be a really big help to us if they pick up one of the maps and help us get the information out. So they're not just looking at maybe our website, but you've got local TV and other media placements. It's an excellent way to do that. So think about who might see it, where they might see it. And then think about, what's the intended experience, right? So we talked about kind of the message and who's going to see it, but what's being communicated, and how long do you expect them to interact with the app? Is this something you want them to basically be able to view, and 30 seconds later they've looked up their address, they see if they're in an area that's impacted or something like that? What data do you really want to put on there? What visualizations are important? What's not important? We see good examples of this and bad examples, where people really think through the content that needs to be on this and what the intended experience is. So even things like symbology, there's symbology that's great for cartographers, but there's also things that are better for the general public. So keep it simple, be simple. And also think about how they're going to interact with the application. Do we want to incorporate pop-ups? Do we want to be comparing data? Do we want them actually creating, editing, or collecting information? Now, obviously, that could be things like crowdsource applications, but it could also be for our own organizations that are collecting that information. So this goes across the board from things we're sharing publicly to just our organization. Do you want them to be able to change the base maps, or just keep it simple? How are they going to explore data? Do they actually want to print it? Or is this just a reference? There's a lot of things to think about with that. Now, with those key things in mind, Kelly's going to kind of take it from here and make it a little bit more strategic and tactical about what you can actually do. Kelly?
All right. So Paul just made a lot of great points about what to include in your application and who your targeted audience is. And that's really going to determine who you design your app for and what the experience is. But when anything's made public, there's always an unintended audience that might pick up on the app or that really loves your app and shares it. So it could just be someone who's surfing the web. It could be the news media, whether or not you've specifically shared that application with the news media, or they've just found it in an internet search. Your town website could decide to embed a web mapping application on their website, or even a tourism website. You might have a really great story map of what happened during a disaster, and that wants to be featured on a tourism site. So there's always this other audience that you might not be planning for, but they may be interested in viewing your app. So then it comes to the question of, what is a viral application? And this can be very different for lots of different users. So it might be 500 views per hour, it might be 1,000 views per hour, or it might be 50,000 views per hour. Whatever is viral, or whatever is viral and means that your application is getting a lot of traction, it means it's viral. There's no specific definition. let's say like 1,000 requests per second within ArcGIS Online. But when we start seeing something that's getting a lot of views, a lot of hits, that's when we start to look at how it's configured and whether or not it's performing in a viral environment.
Yeah, when Kelly and I were preparing for this and talking about it, I think one of the things that we wanted to make sure everybody kind of got the viral idea, but it's also, I think you can make the assumption that in a lot of these cases where there's information out there, just assume it's going to get picked up by the media, and just assume every citizen is going to be looking at this application over and over and over, or looking up their address over and over. So making it viral, making sure it's available to be viral is really important.
Right, especially in disaster responses. There's frequently times where people are constantly refreshing the boundaries of a fire. So one person viewing it, they might be viewing the app multiple times within the period of a minute. So just keep those things in mind. So when you're planning for your app to go viral, and again, any public app, you should do some planning on how to configure it for a viral load in case it happens. So here are some basic assumptions that you should be making. One, that the potential audience is the entire world. So make sure that if it's going public and you want to be using it to communicate to the public, it's configured so that it will scale. The other thing is performance. You want the app to load quickly. So that's either having the widgets load quickly or the data load quickly. You want it to be drawn in probably about 3 seconds. If not, you might have some users that walk away or say, hey, this isn't working. And I've got all components need to withstand up to 1,000 requests per second, but that's really up to you in terms of what your desired performance is in terms of load. Functionality, you want the users to be able to figure out the tools without any instructions. So it's always great to have instructions on you click this and then you click this, but your app ideally is intuitive enough that someone can just figure out what buttons they need to click in order to complete the desired interaction. All right, so one of the big things to think about is choosing the right layer. And I'm going to show a quick example of some differences between feature layers and tile layers. So in this example, and I'm just going to hit go now, and you'll see that there are 2 of the exact same map using different layer types, and they load at different speeds. So you'll see that the tiles are already loaded, and the features are slowly coming in. And you'll also notice that there are boxes around this base map. I've done this on purpose so that you can actually see how the tiles are set up when they actually load in. And if we can go back to the slides, I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between tile layers and feature layers. Excellent. So if we can go to the next slide. And I'll just start talking a little bit about tile layers. Yeah, hosted tile layers. So hosted tile layers were the first example where the layers drew really quickly. What they are pre-rendered images of a map. So in the specific example that we just saw, there was over 100,000 points. So what happens is ArcGIS Online pre-generates these images of what it needs to look like, and that image is ready to come back when it's requested from the application. They're really helpful for drawing complex geometry like boundaries, anything where there's a lot of vertices that's not updating. Because this is pre-generated, we want to make sure that the data isn't updating and that it's complex, that you'll actually see a performance benefit in terms of drawing speed by using it. There's some options to create tiles automatically. So this is where you can actually publish a feature layer and then have the tiles generate as users are looking at the specific areas. This way you only generate the tiles that need to be generated, and then they'll actually update as the underlying data updates. Again, this isn't a workflow for constantly updating data, but it's really good if, let's say, you have something that updates once a week, once a month. The other option that you have when using hosted tile layers is you can buddy them up with a feature layer. And what that means is you'll end up using the tile layer for rendering. So when the actual images display of where your geospatial data is, and then you can use a feature layer for the underlying information. So you can use that to get queryable information like evacuation statuses. So you get kind of the best of both worlds of having a really fast rendering map, and then also the information is coming up from the feature layer. All right, and then when we take a look at hosted feature layers, they're really great for data where the underlying data is updating frequently. So let's say you're doing shelter, you're doing damage inspections, and you want you want part of your team out in the field getting damage assessments, and then you also want to be viewing the updated data. This is a really great use of feature layers. With feature layers, you have the freedom to change the style. So instead of pre-generating the data to look as you originally styled it, you can change it to show different things, symbolizing your data on different variables, and having it update as the underlying data updates. You can also use features for analysis. Yeah, it's really great for using feature layer views to display an editable data set. And that's using hosted feature layer views. I will talk about disabling editing on public layers because it's really important, but you can always make a view-only version of editable layer so that the general public doesn't have access to an editable data set. Another tip is to set the cache control, which I'll demo a little bit later, and then make sure editing is disabled on a public hosted feature layer. All right, and we'll go back to this demo that we saw a little bit earlier. And we're going to take a look at the different requests that are being sent. So just as a refresher, we've got the tiles that came in pretty quickly, and you'll see that the feature layers are, the feature requests are coming in a little bit slower. And we asked the polling question a little bit earlier about what your familiarity is with requests and responses. So this really comes down to what types of requests we're sending to the server to get the information back out of either the database or where you're storing your locations. When we're making a request to a tile layer, it's really just this small image that's coming back. So you can see how that responds really quickly. We can easily see the features and where it actually lines up in the map. Now, if we take a look at what's happening with this feature tile request, which again was slower, sorry, with the feature service request, you can see it's a lot of information and it's still loading right now. And it's a lot of text information that the web browser then renders on the application. So as you can see here, with all of these different little squares, a different request is sent for each of these locations to actually get the data back from the server. And as you can see, there's tons of it, and it's much larger. And this is why the feature tiles, this is why the features or the feature tiles, which are actually a request of the tile area, can be slower if there's a lot of information in that response, which is sometimes where we want to go to the tile layers. And then back to the slides. So when we talk about ArcGIS Online Scalability, we're really going to be talking about how to make those large feature tile requests and responses optimized so that they respond as quickly as they can and are optimized to perform well under really high loads. If you're using the data set that I was just showing with all of those features and they weren't updating, I would definitely recommend going tiles because the response is just so large. But when there is a smaller response, let's say you're showing a couple thousand features, what we really want to do is make sure that we're using all of the logic that's built into ArcGIS Online to make this perform well under load. So ArcGIS Online scales to meet the demand of an audience. So whether we need to scale up and have more resources available or improve the caching, so the caching within ArcGIS Online So, so we can efficiently get that feature request without having to go into the database every time. So queries to large data sets are sent as tiled requests. Again, this is for features, not tiles, but it is a feature tile request. And then the responses are cached. So there's 3 places where we can actually cache this information so that it's already available when the web application sends the request to the server and pulls it back. So the first level is a browser cache, which is on the client side. So what that is when, and there's an animation for this. Perfect. So when the query is made to the feature layer, it checks in with the browser to see if that response is already cached in the browser. If it is, then the response will come back and the data will draw immediately. If it's not there, with public layers, we'll check to see if the CDN has a cache of the data set. CDN is a cloud delivery network, and what happens is when a request is sent to the server, we cache all those public layers in different areas around the world so it will respond quickly. When an application goes and makes a request to the CDN, we check to see if it's there. If it's there, great, we'll take that information and it will be displayed in the application. If there's no information about the CDN cache, then we'll check for the feature tile request and see if it has the latest data. So that's another level of caching. And then if this request hasn't been cached before, so hasn't been made before or has changed, then we'll actually execute a new query to the database. So when an app is under load, we want to reduce the amounts of queries to the databases, as it's really just the same response that's coming back. So if we can efficiently already have that information saved, it's much easier to scale to a larger audience if we have these different caches around so we can efficiently get the information. So when you're going through a checklist for the data for a layer that you're going to be using in an app that could potentially go viral, the first thing you want to do is make sure that editing is disabled on all public feature layers. There's 2 reasons for this. The first one is data security. If you share an editable layer with the public, someone's going to go in and draw something or put in incorrect information. We have tons of examples of it. So just make sure that if you're editing, if you have an editable layer, it's only shared with the people that you trust to edit that data. The other thing with editing is it takes all of that information out of the cache, out of the CDN cache, out of any caching that we set, because the layer is anticipating frequent edits. So the logic is built in to not use the cache. So those are the real 2 reasons to make sure that editing is disabled on all public features layers. The other thing is to set a cache control interval, and this is new in the last release, where you can actually set how long we store this response on the CDN cache. So if you set it up for 5 minutes, it means your data is probably, you'd set it up for 5 minutes because your data is not updating more often than every 5 minutes. And then what you would see is that the CDN won't check back with the database until 5 minutes has passed. What that does is it really reduces the amount of load on the database. You want to make sure that you set a refresh interval within a web map that aligns with your data update schedule. So if you have data that's updating, let's say every 5 minutes, you don't need to have a refresh interval that's updating every 30 seconds. So just make sure that that cache control, refresh interval, and data update schedule align. Make sure you're using tile layers for static data. If you have boundary data, that's a great, that's not changing. Let's say it's state boundaries, county boundaries. That's a great reason to use tile layers. And then only include the tools and layers that are relevant to your intended message. So I think the base map switcher is my favorite example of this. And a lot of times we like to put in the option for users to change between the 6 base maps that we have available on ArcGIS Online. But most of the time, you really only need to switch between 2 if you need to switch at all. So maybe it's your roads map and an imagery your roads base map and your imagery base map, or really just the imagery base map where they can see the information. Really ensure that you're showing exactly what you need to show in the map, and that those tools are relevant. Because if not, if someone's trying to pick a shelter location or an evacuation area, they could spend 2 or 3 minutes just changing the base maps because the option's there instead of actually searching for their address. You want to ensure that the interactive experience is intuitive and easy to understand. You can do this by making sure that widgets are available when you launch the application. I always get my mom to look at things because she's not the most computer savvy person. So it's great to have something that your desired audience, if you have a test audience, can use and that it's easy to understand. And then you want to make sure you test your application and test it again. Test it in incognito mode, so all of the permissions have been taken away if you've signed into your browser. So the next part is that I'm going to show is how to check your feature layer to make sure that it's actually falling within those settings that I just talked about. So if you can see here, this is a boundaries layer. It's a hosted feature layer. I'm always going to make sure when I'm making a public layer that editing is not enabled. You can see if I enable, I'll enable editing in a second. There's also this cache control setting, and this is where you can set the cache control interval that you actually want to set. So this can significantly reduce the map load time and the responsiveness. So I would recommend for all public apps having a cache control set of at least 5 minutes. If 15 minutes will work, I'd even recommend going up there. It'll just make it so that the app performs better. And these options will be hidden if or grayed out if the layer isn't shared publicly. So if I go ahead and I save the editing settings here, you'll see that I no longer have the option to set the cache control. So it's really important that we have that set up and that you can understand when this is set and when this isn't. All right, and we can go back to the slides. And that, I guess, ends the best practices for setting up layers for viral apps.
Thanks, Kelly.
So thanks, Paul. Thanks, Kelly, for that. I think there was a ton of good information there. I think that Kelly hit some of the major areas that we find, especially in these viral apps that people ask, what are the configurations I need to be thinking about to go viral? I think she did a great job of highlighting those things. And, Kelly, I think even before we let you go on this side at the end of the webinar here, there was a question that came in. I think it's worth highlighting again because you hit on it. It's really important. So the question was, can I have an editable layer shared with the public? So is there a way to share an editable layer with the public? So just, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just touch on that one more time because it is something I think people just need to reinforce a bit here.
Yeah, so it is functionally possible to share an editable layer with the public. What we want you to do is really think about why that layer is being shared with the public. There's a lot of great examples of crowdsourcing, of surveys where we have editable layers that are shared with the public. Where you don't want the editable layer shared with the public is in a situation where the data is critical. You only have a specific group that really has the knowledge to update the data properly. And then a lot of times the editable layers are just left editable by accident. So it's really important that you check this in your apps before you go ahead and share an editable layer. Now, again, if you're using some type of crowdsourcing application, you're aware that that's what you want to be doing. You're looking for public input. That's where you want to think about how you want to edit the data, what kind of data you want to see, the security of protecting your users' information. But that's definitely possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. So I think you hit at the right point. So be purposeful when you do it, right? Know what that means when you put an editable layer out to the public and just make sure that it is the right layer for the right purpose and protect those other things that are kind of, again, mission critical, internal things you want to control. Make sure you follow those best practices there. All right, so just a bit of a recap and some next steps that you can take here. So there were 3 things we covered today around scalability, availability, and capability. the links on the screen here will take you to different resources to really deep dive into each one of these areas. So for scalability, we're going to send you to esri.com/disaster. That is where you can also request assistance for our response program to help you out during time of need. You'll find a great blog that Kelly and Paul have put together about how to architect your apps for viral load. There's some great tips and detail to read that blog. You'll find in the resources section within that. So spend some time there. You'll also see kind of how we're activated and some examples of good public facing maps and applications. And then the availability side, so you're going to get a link to this webinar after. Go back to esri.com/PS webinar. That will take you to the recording to kind of deep dive into this. So there is the white paper as well. We will make sure you get the link to that best practices document that really aggregates a lot of the components together. And that's worth a deeper conversation, as Ray and Sarah put it, right, to understand what level you need to have and what service level you're going to agree upon as an organization. And how do you mitigate that? How do you manage that in both ways? And so that's typically a hybrid approach to those conversations. And so let us know how we can help you understand how to architect a hybrid approach or an on-premise approach, depending on how you prefer to move forward. We can certainly help in either way. And then capability, the last part. So I would say, learn the patterns that we talked about at the very beginning of this webinar, implement solutions to this. I would almost use those 3 big buckets of situational awareness and damage assessment and public information as mileposts for you as an organization to really kind of assess where you are as an agency. Do we have solutions for each one of those capabilities? And if so, are they working together, right? Are they integrated, moving data between each other for that kind of decision support as it's truly needed? And if so, that's great. And if not, I would encourage you to go to the link here, esri.com/emergency management. You will get a great picture of what it means to be kind of ready in terms of capabilities using ArcGIS. And trust me, I think those are the things that we see most common that we know if you have a solution to, you're at least better off for the next event. And then plan in advance. So if you've got questions, you have ideas, you need support, you want to just ask somebody to come sit down and talk about any one of these 3 things to kind of help you get better prepared as an agency, we're here. So you can certainly reach me at my email address there, Ryan Landcloss. So it's rlandcloss@esri.com. Go to the website, let us know, submit a request there directly from the website as you land, and we'll certainly follow up after this. You'll get a prompt here. So for those urgent needs, if you think you're facing something right now that you've got a question about, certainly let us know as soon as you in the webinar today. You'll get a prompt there to say have somebody reach out, and we will certainly expedite getting somebody there to kind of help you get ready for the next one from there. So with that, I just want to say thanks to our presenters. Thanks to all of you for attending this full year. A lot of you have attended over the full cycle of the Emergency Management Webinar Series. We will see you again in 2019. We're going to take the holidays off and recoup, but know that we are standing by if you need us in the interim until we see you again on the next webinar in early 2019. So with that, thanks again, Paul, Kelly, to Ray and Sarah. Thank you guys for attending, and we'll see you next time.